You know that feeling of disgust when you reach into your kitchen sink and feel the moist, soggy remains of an indistinguishable foodstuff? Or walking barefoot across the kitchen in the middle of the night and stepping on a slug? If these mental images cause you to recoil in disgust, then buckle up for that dialed up to 10, because today we're looking at Scorn. Before playing this game, I saw many comparisons to Sombre, which admittedly did give me the impression we would be seeing impressive world building, a compelling narrative, alongside body horror. Scorn did deliver on the overall atmosphere, but there is no obvious narrative to the game. Scorn has no map, no dialogue, and no text. You move through the world via organic exploration, but the game does limit where you're able to go. I would by no means consider that an open world format. It almost felt quite linear in its layout. You are able to explore, but only within set areas. Once you move on to the next area, there is no turning back. The story is very much left up to the player to decipher, if there even is one. There's some similarities that can be drawn to the Dark Souls games, in that it tells a story through its environment, but with even less to go on than the From Software games. You're just following a character making their way through this grotesque and horrifying world, where you can't tell what is organic and what is machine, as the two are so seamlessly blended throughout. I can definitely see this being polarising to people, and it left me feeling conflicted when I reached the end of the game. I'm always a fan of showing and not telling, but I'm not sure what this game was trying to show me. Ultimately, my conclusion of the story was that it was a sad tale of extreme loneliness, which left me feeling hollow, wondering what the point of all that was. For that alone, it actually gets my praise, as I love a film, game, or TV show that leaves me thinking. But Scorn almost feels more like an experience, a proof of concept, as opposed to a fully fledged game. Apart from the relatively linear open-world exploration, the other main feature of the game are the puzzles. In order to progress through each area, you need to solve mostly large-scale environmental puzzles, such as the type you'd see in Tomb Raider, only much more moist. The puzzles are fairly challenging, and some I only managed to solve through sheer luck. So without the presence of a story driving us forward, Scorn is just a puzzle game, but set in a disturbing environment. Early on in the game, you're also given two choices with one of the puzzles that involves another being, which further reminded me of Sombre. It's the moral dilemma of whether it is truly the right decision to show mercy to another being in a world such as this. This was the only real example of this though, and the theme wasn't continued throughout the game. Of course, this wouldn't be much of a review if we didn't mention that gloriously grotesque nature of Scorn's environment design. Ebb Software's main focus was providing the player with a profound sense of foreboding and atmosphere. The meticulously designed and detailed levels communicate to the player the decaying and abandoned nature of the facility, while at the same time subtly hinting at the sprawling complex's former functions. Whatever these functions might have been, it's again left for the player to decide. As I alluded to earlier, a core theme running throughout Scorn and its design is show don't tell, and for good reason. There is no spoken or written dialogue in the entire game, so the team at Ebb Software have relied heavily on a visual learning process to aid the player in progression. You're provided with no hints, it's all up to you to figure out. Which is why I found some of those puzzles a little bit challenging. Consoles, keys, weapons and machines will look at first entirely alien to the player in their specific designs. However, once the player interacts with them through experimentation, their true nature and function will become apparent. This is also true of Scorn's limited arsenal of weapons available, with each having a unique design but are recognisable enough for the player to grasp their function. The juxtaposition of familiar yet unfamiliar does credit Ebb Software's skill at visual design. Scorn contains a relatively diverse array of environments and themes throughout the experience, ranging from outdoor wastelands, mysterious abandoned factories, and sacred temple-like ruins, with each area having its own theme, colour palette and ambience to match. Considering their heavy focus on environment design and aesthetics, I believe this aspect of the game is the most rewarding of all. The considerable amount of cut content has sacrificed much of the lore and backstory. However, the game still has something of a story to tell, particularly when it comes to conveying moods and emotion to its audience. whether that be shock, trepidation, sadness, and even at certain points awe and quiet reverence. Perhaps it is more accurate to view the experience as a visual art installation, with Scorn's sombre and morbid tapestries being presented to the player as a form of macabre visual poetry. For a lack of narrative, this is where the game's true strength was, and held my attention long enough to complete it over a course of only a couple of days. The creature visual design is certainly interesting, if somewhat limited due to the aforementioned cut content. Many early encounters with enemies in the game involve a handful of creature designs, with only 1 or 2 encounters being truly unique. Nonetheless, the creature designs certainly do make an impact in terms of visual quality and potential to disturb. No game survives the cutting room floor completely intact though, and Scorn is no exception. It is always a risk in game development that no matter how interesting the vision for the project might be, whether it be assets, creatures, environments or encounters, not everything makes it into the final product. And for me here, definitely not enough made it into the final product. As detailed in the game's art book, Scorn, The Art of the Game, Ebb Software had originally intended for the game to follow a more open-ended pacing style, with the player exploring the world from a central hub a la Dark Souls. There was also a greater focus on exploration, with the player being solely responsible for their own survival. If the player neglected to explore their surroundings carefully, they may miss resources necessary to their survival and perhaps miss a key item, the consequences of which might be felt later in the game. Ebb Software had also originally planned a stealth mechanic in the game. The wasteland the player begins their journey in was to include wandering monsters that would attack and kill the player on sight. The design of this sequence was to teach the player about the stealth system, offering them another tool in their goal of surviving Scorn's world. 3 areas were additionally cut from the game. As I've mentioned before, this sadly sacrificed much of the game's backstory and lore, which would have provided the player with some much needed context regarding Scorn's universe. I do have plenty of positive things to say though. The sound design in Scorn is probably the best I've ever heard in any game, with every sound effect meticulously designed to provoke an emotional response in the player, and it perfectly reflects the horrendous and otherworldly nature of Scorn's universe. Quality sound design is an essential aspect of any game, especially horror games. It is even more so important in Scorn, as the player is dropped into a world composed of a blend of fleshy, organic processes and harsh mechanical devices in operation. The organic components of the devices found in the world have no shortage of appropriately squelchy, crunchy and moist sound effects to accompany their functions. In contrast, the mechanical devices have incredibly harsh and brutal sound effects that border on intimidating, and the sound design perfectly captures the decaying nature of the facility. The blending of these seemingly opposite yet similar processes and their accompanying sounds leaves the player wondering if they are exploring a factory or some kind of decaying body. Creature and NPC sound design is also excellent. Every monster encounters issues its own horrendous and terrifying calls with inhuman clarity, such to the point when you encounter a creature you will be compelled to acknowledge its presence. Voice acting is virtually non-existent, as Scorn contains no actual dialogue. Voices are heard, however, but these are mostly in the form of grunts of pain, with 1 or 2 scenes in particular being made especially unsettling owing to the talent of Scorn's voice acting and sound direction. Environmental sound cues aid in immersing the player with Scorn's biomechanical world, all while providing them with a sense of unease and at time leaving them wonder whether they are in danger or not. The soundtrack is also worthy of a mention. Ebb Software employed the talented musicians and sound designers Athek and Brian Lustmord Williams, who provided the game's haunting and ethereal ambience. The weapons featured in Scorn were not neglected in sound design either. Firing them rewards the player with the most deafening and devastating rapport. The choice in sound design hammers home the confirmation of their destructive power, and reloading or switching weapons provides the player with a variety of satisfyingly crunchy and more squelchy noises. So while the weapon sound design is exemplary, it begs the question of whether the combat matches it. The answer is unfortunately not, and I would have preferred they go down the sombre route and have no combat at all, making it purely a survival horror. This would have been fitting for the world we're navigating through as well. The design of the weapons is fantastic, there's no faulting that. They're so grotesque in both sound and appearance, and you can't help but admire the thought that goes into them. They are, however, slow to reload against enemies that attack fairly quickly. This isn't necessarily an issue on its own, but it becomes a problem because the game has no dodge mechanic. I did adopt the tactic of just running past enemies, but without being able to dodge, it's easy to get stuck against them in the narrow passages. You also don't have any ability to jump, which further hinders your mobility. If these mechanics had been included, I think it would have taken the edge off how frustrating the combat was. But I still don't think the game needed it at all. The risk of not including it though is that the game would have felt even more empty, then it really would have just been an atmospheric puzzle game. But that being said, taking it out could have maybe meant they could have included more of the lore or extra areas. An imperfect work of art, Scorn is not catering to the masses. While severely lacking in its narrative and combat, it's a disturbing and thought-provoking experience, which I can't help but kind of like. I have my own headcanon of what the story is and what happened to this world, and it makes for a haunting cautionary tale. If you're a fan of puzzles, it definitely does deliver here, and if you're a fan of the works of HR Geiger, you'll also appreciate the world that Ebb Software have built. Hopefully this gives you an idea of whether you want to check out this very moist game. Thank you very much for watching. I promise to never use the word moist that much in a review ever again. If you've made it this far, please also do consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you.